In our last segment, I was talking to you about this war for empire, how the British and the French are pretty much going at it all across the world, but also in North America, and how this is changing the dynamic, the relationship between Britain and her colonies over here in North America. And I want to continue with that topic here today. One of the first things that I need to establish is the British won the war, and with it they got a lot of the spoils of the war, the land that was under dispute, the Ohio River Valley, but they also took on an enormous amount of debt in order to win it. So they're strapped for cash, and they're beginning to look for a way out. 1764, and in the aftermath of that, they're really beginning to look for a way to kind of minimize that war debt. Now, the other problem is the policing of the empire. I alluded to this in the last video that now what the British were left with in Quebec is not only the land, but they were also left with these French colonists who didn't like them very much. We were talking about this with respect to Pontiac's rebellion. You have a tangible reason, a very vivid, easy to understand reason as to why there should be a British military presence in the Americas, even though the king is not necessarily at war. So the point with me telling you this is really twofold. Number one, having those troops over there is not free. In addition to everything else, it's going to cost money. You're already hard strapped for cash in the first place. So my point is you better find some creative resources to tap when it comes to generating some of this money. The other thing that I need you to be mindful of is an age-old, like a medieval old policy in England that emphasized if the king is not currently at war, you should not be seeing any of his soldiers hanging around. And clearly the king was not at war after 1763 when the British emerged victoriously, but here are all these British regulars roaming the streets in colonial cities throughout North America. And that really did not set too well with the colonists, considering they came from an English heritage, they understood this tradition, and they resented the fact that not only are the British here, they're now being asked to pay for them. Okay? So anyway, there had to be a way to dig Britain out of debt, and so one of the things that it begins to do is begins to really tighten the rein of control with respect to the American colonies. For instance, one official in Parliament was a guy by the name of Lord Bute, and Lord Bute said, it's pretty simple, really. We've had some of these laws on the books for a long, long time now. For instance, we've had an import-export duty, a tax for importing or exporting things like sugar and tobacco. We've had those laws on the books for years. We've just never enforced them. We've let the Americans get away with what we call salutary neglect. The British military, the British law enforcement officials watched us breaking the law. They just didn't enforce the law because we were good for business. I mean, why upset a happy relationship? Why make the Americans mad? I mean, maybe we're not paying as much money as we should, but we're still making Britain rich. Why upset that relationship if they didn't have to? Well, after 1763, they could no longer indulge us any longer, and so therefore they began to say, look, we're going to get serious about collecting some of these taxes that you have been ignoring for years. Now, one of the things that the American colonists began to say is, if you're going to tax us, then you should give us some representation. No taxation without representation. Well, we didn't have any representation in London, in Parliament. And so therefore, there were a lot of colonists that considered these laws never to be legitimate in the first place, and they said we're perfectly justified in continuing our ignoring of them. So, in 1763, George Grenville becomes Prime Minister, the British version of President. That's about the best way that I have to describe the Prime Minister. Grenville was an incredibly capable individual. He was seen as the guy that really could get Britain set right and get them out of debt. In order to do that, though, he had to pass a couple laws, several laws really, that got tougher on the American colonies, especially when it came to generating revenue. So in 1764, he issues something called the Currency Act. Now, for years, the way that people had bought British products from an American standpoint was through something called colonial currency. Colonial currency was more or less like monopoly money. It was just paper thin. It really didn't matter. Every state, well, colony in the empire had theirs. Massachusetts had theirs. New York had theirs. Georgia had theirs. And nobody really bothered to note that it really didn't mean anything outside of, here's a paper dollar, please accept this for the debt I owe you. The British allowed us to get away with this primarily because, again, we were good for business, and two, they had ways of laundering the money and, processing it, and those ways went away after the war when they were deeply, deeply in debt. So the Currency Act really didn't reinvent the wheel. All it said was, from now on, you're going to have to pay us for British products in either gold or silver. And so this is going to increase the cost of living for a lot of people, especially merchants in places like Boston and Philadelphia. And so it was incredibly unpopular. Even more unpopular than the Currency Act was the Sugar Act. Now, first of all, the Sugar Act was nothing new. Over 30 years before the establishment of the Sugar Act, you saw the Molasses Act, which it was a very small tax on the importation of molasses. Now, if you know anything about molasses, if you distill it, it will turn into rum. And before it's molasses, it's sugar. So really you're talking about the distilling of sugar to make alcoholic beverages, including rum, which had become a really, really profitable and important industry in places like Boston. Okay? People like John Hancock, who had been importing Dutch sugar for years, had become what you and I would call a millionaire, basically by ignoring the law. Well, all the Sugar Act said was what the Molasses Act had said 30 years before, that now, from 1764 forward, please understand that you are going to have to only buy British sugar, first of all, and second of all, there will be a tax on British sugar. It'll be relatively modest, but we have to find a way to generate some revenue here. Well, there are a lot of people that began to beat that drum of no taxation without representation. But there was even more at stake as far as colonial lawyers were concerned. One of the ways that the British were finding these illegal smugglers, keep in mind, mercantilistic policies that emphasized that the only kind of companies that British citizens, irregardless of where they were in the British Empire, the only kind of companies that they could legally do business with were other British companies, including sugar companies. Well, one of the ways that the British law enforcement officials were finding these smugglers were by issuing writs of assistance. And they would issue these writs of assistance, and then they would just board this merchant vessel, this ship that was coming up from the Caribbean taking this illegal smuggled sugar. Now, understand something. There is no such thing as the American Bill of Rights just yet. That's several decades really into the future. But there had been laws that had been established long ago in England that emphasized you had a reasonable right to privacy in your own things, meaning your own ships, your own homes, your own possessions. And here the British are getting around that right simply by issuing this writ of assistance and boarding the ship and seizing the sugar illegally. So that was really dangerous as far as colonial lawyers are concerned, because if you let the law enforcement officials get away with that, what else are they going to get away with, right? The law is the law, and if we're going to assume that we all have reasonable rights of privacy in our own dwellings, then that's really the classic adage of you give them an inch and they're going to take a mile, okay? Now, what was worse is the way that they were trying some of those sugar smugglers. We had been used to trying our own alleged criminals. In other words, if you were accused of being a smuggler, you went on trial in Boston amongst a jury of Bostonians. What the British are doing is using something called vice admiralty courts. They're sailing people out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean where there is no jurisdiction. There is no British law, there is no American law, there is no French law, there is no law. It's international waters. And a British judge on a British ship is serving as judge, jury, and executioner, right? So there's a lot of really, I guess you would call them shady things that are going on amongst British law enforcement officials and that really has the attention of colonial lawyers like James Otis and Francis Bernard that are saying, look, there comes a point in time where you need to draw a line in the sand and say, we will not tolerate this. You are trampling upon our rights as British citizens. But the real kicker was the Stamp Act in 1765, okay? Whereas the Sugar Act was annoying, there were ways of avoiding it. You could stop buying products that had sugar in them, various other ways of boycotting the products that the British were trying to tax. No such luck with the Stamp Act. Now, when I say stamp, I bet most of you think of postage, what you put on a letter to have it move from point A to point B. I'm not talking about postage. I'm literally talking about a stamp, right? A stamp would be required for anything that had print on it. So newspapers had print on it, and books had print on it. But so too did legal contracts. So again, you've got the attention of colonial lawyers. Leases, if you wanted to lease a store, if you wanted to lease a home, that had print on it. Any kind of printed item, even playing cards were being taxed. You needed a stamp, and you had to pay a tax to get that stamp. And so, again, we start creating this big fuss about no taxation without representation. And the British said, look, we have to get out of debt here. You've got a vested interest in seeing Britain get out of debt too. And we said to that end, we already made this contribution to your war. I mean, ever since the Albany Congress, we provided the men and much of the material that had been used to fight this thing, and now you're asking for us to pay for it as well. As far as we were concerned, it's your debt, you pay for it, okay? So what we began to do was convene as a colonial society, again, members from Massachusetts, members from New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, they all began to send representatives into something called the Stamp Act Congress. And one of the things that the Stamp Act Congress said was, maybe we should boycott British goods. I mean, we are, after all, the British #1 customer. And so if we simply stop buying their stuff, that would make a major dent in their economy, and maybe they would listen to us when it comes to giving us some representation. Because right now what they're saying is we have virtual representation. I mean, those commercials that say that they're going to get their dishes virtually spotless. Right? It means that you're going to get your dishes almost spotless, but still a few spots. Virtual representation, what the British meant was there were American sugar farmers in Barbados, Jamaica, that were technically American. The only problem was they didn't govern their plantations from the Americas, they governed them from London, and they had made their way into Parliament, and that's what the British were pointing to when it comes to our representatives. We had virtual representatives. Well, the American colonists didn't buy this, and so again, this is a major wedge between Britain and the colonists when it comes to what are our rights. Even worse, the British government in 1765 issued something called the Quartering Act. And what the Quartering Act did is it required American colonists to pay to build barracks, to build military bases to house these British soldiers. Well, we've already found out why we didn't like the soldiers, didn't want them around in the first place, and here again we're being asked to pay for this. We felt that that was a violation of our colonial rights. So what the Stamp Act ultimately created was an institution known as the Sons of Liberty, okay? Now, the British didn't call them the Sons of Liberty, they called them the rabble, right? The rednecks, the trash, all of these rabble-rousers, these demonstrators and protesters that were basically criminals, or little better than criminals. Now, it's the Sons of Liberty that are going to lead rallies and make it be known that we will not tolerate any kind of violation of our natural rights as British citizens. Really what you're talking about is a glorified street gang that are committing riots, beating up British stamp collectors and other officials, and generally speaking, intimidating British officials over here that are simply trying to do their job. Okay? Now, while many quote-unquote founding fathers are insisting that these Sons of Liberty are nothing more than these young, urban, unemployed male workers that, would be much better served if they had a job, really they're being controlled by people working behind the scenes. I'm talking about people like John Hancock. He was a really important leader of the Sons of Liberty, even though he didn't necessarily wear that on his sleeve. But behind the scenes, and relatively secretly, it's John Hancock that's not only encouraging the Sons of Liberty, he's actually providing some financial sustenance to them too. People like James Otis or the Dr. Joseph Warren, these are all people that were encouraging and to some extent leading the crowd of the Sons of Liberty because they have selfish purposes behind them. They don't want a Sugar Act, they don't want a Stamp Act, because what that's going to do is it's going to raise the cost of doing business and potentially jeopardize their economic interests over here in the Americas. Okay? So again, one of the things that we begin doing is talking about what should be done. And so one of the places that are going to take on a really important role in American life are taverns. Taverns, bars, saloons, pubs, they're places where American colonists would discuss what should be done. Now keep in mind, guys, one of the things that I've mentioned is you now have British regular soldiers that are combing the streets. So you wouldn't want to do this out in the open. There were specific pubs, specific taverns that you would go to if you wanted to talk about this. And there were also the emergence of these secret underground societies. For example, the Masonic Lodge of St. Andrew, the Masonic Lodge of St. Andrew. The Masons, the modern day institution that is the Masons, basically got their start as a secret society where you could come and kind of talk about what ought to be done as it relates to the British and how they were violating our rights as natural citizens. One of the really important Masons in this whole discussion would be Paul Revere. Now, it's Revere that's going to be a really important player in the propagandization of the American Revolution. He's going to be a guy that really produces a really powerful piece of propaganda as it relates to the coming of the American Revolution. But at the same time, he's a really important figure within the Masons network, because it's Revere that's really taking this information from various persons and communicating it to them. So he's going to become a really important figure within this patriot movement that's beginning to evolve. Now, what you're about to find out is that the Americans are about to, what I like to think of as throw a fit, right? Think of a toddler in Target not getting something that they want. They kick, they scream, they stomp, they swear, and, you know, in a lot of cases they get their own way. The parents give in. That's exactly what's going to happen in 1766. In 1766, the British are going to repeal the Stamp Act, right? We had thrown our fit and we had gotten our way, and the British repealed the Stamp Act, which is what we wanted. But in its place, it issued something called the Declaratory Act of 1766. Now, all the Declaratory Act says is, British law is supreme. The British are in charge. That's all it says. It doesn't say anything else. So for all intents and purposes, it's a nothing of a law. It's a hollow shell of nothing. But what it demonstrates is the struggle has changed. The struggle before 1766 was to decide where we're going to get all this money to pay for our debt. The struggle after 1766 is who is in charge. The Declaratory Act says it's the British that are in charge, and it's the Americans that are going to need to take orders. And so that's going to be where we pick it up the next time we meet, when we talk about the repeal of the Stamp Act and the establishment of the Townshend Act and the emergence of Charles Townshend as the British Prime Minister.